Hi, thank you for joining us today for SNF Agora Conversations. I'm Hari Han. I'm a professor of political science at Johns Hopkins University and also director of the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins. The SNF Agora Institute, for those of you who don't know, is an academic and public forum dedicated to improving and expanding civic engagement and informed, inclusive dialogue as the cornerstone of global democracy. We started SNF Conversations in this webcast series in March as a new weekly series that was designed to take a social scientific approach to examining some of the most vexing political and social questions surrounding the pandemic. But for the past few weeks, we've been pivoting away from the pandemic to focus on the extraordinary political moment that we're experiencing both here in the United States and around the world. And we're continuing that conversation today. Today's topic is protest, activism, and democracy. And I'm delighted to be joined today by three terrific scholars. We're joined today by Kanisha Bond, who's an assistant professor of political science at Binghamton University, Filipe Campante, who is the vice dean for education and academic affairs at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, and the Bloomberg Distinguished Associate Professor of International Economics at Johns Hopkins, very long title, and Erica Chenoweth, who also has a long title, is a Bertold Beitz Professor in Human Rights and International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School, and a Susan S. and Kenneth L. Wallach Professor at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies at Harvard University. So thank you all for being here with us today. So the four of us are going to spend about 30 minutes trying to make sense of the extraordinary wave of protests that we've been seeing all over the world and drawing on the collective expertise of the group. And then we're going to open it up for your questions. But anytime throughout this session, you can submit your question through the dialog box. Depending on what kind of device you're using, the box should either appear to the right of your video or underneath it, depending on what your device is. So I'm going to start just by asking each of our panelists to reflect a little bit on what they're seeing. And Erica, maybe I'll start with you, because we come into this conversation witnessing what a lot of people have called this sort of movement moment that characterizes politics in the United States right now. And I know you've written a lot about the scope and the scale of the protests. I'm wondering if you can describe to us some of the work that you've done with the crowd counting consortium, and then also what you're seeing in this moment.
Sure, thanks a lot, Harry, and thanks for inviting me. So the crowd counting consortium is a project that I co-direct with Jeremy Pressman of the University of Connecticut, and with a team of research assistants and volunteers. What we're doing is trying to provide timely and reliable documentation of protest, counter-protest, and police response during the Trump administration. So this project's been going on since the Women's March of 2017. And we essentially crowdsource data from a number of different sources that help us to get a sense of the scope, scale, size of mobilization in the United States on any given day. And you know, as you mentioned in the intro, we are in this really unprecedented and unique time of mass mobilization. Jeremy and I have estimated that about 29 million people in the country have participated in protests since the Women's March of 2017 in almost 45,000 distinct events that we've cataloged so far. That's an incomplete count, but it gives you a sense of the scale of what we're talking about in general. Now, of those 29 million people across 45,000 events, over 10% of those are associated with the past 5 weeks alone. And probably it's going to be a much higher proportion when we finish the counting. We've only probably counted about half of the events in up through the first 3 weeks of June, and still have more to code. Among those, we have over 5,000 events that we've already documented since the last week of May through the third week of June, and millions of participants. So this is clearly the largest, broadest, and most sustained mobilization in US history in terms of the geographic scope. That is how many different localities have been experiencing an event of any size, the number of events that we've witnessed in a short amount of period, and potentially the number of participants. So as I mentioned, we count the number of people that are observed at a demonstration. Often we report a low count or a low estimate because the estimates are hard to really capture. But polling suggests that between 10 and 24 million people in the United States have participated in a racial justice protest in the last 5 weeks. So that is an extraordinary number. There's no movement in the US that's ever galvanized that many people in such a short amount of time. That's between 3 and 7% of the US population. To put this in context, the largest single-day demonstration in US history before that was the Women's March of January 2017, with between 4 and 6 million people, about 1.8% of the population. So we're in well over double that at this point, maybe even 3 times as many. And what I'll say before I pass it on to another of our colleagues is that I think that this moment really reflects the kind of accumulative organizational capacity and resources that have been developing over the last really decade, I'd say, in this country, but have accelerated over the past 3.5 years. With Lara Putnam and Jeremy Pressman, we wrote a piece recently that talks about the youth dimension of these actions. And Kanisha and I actually had worked with Jeremy on collecting data on school districts that held gun control protests back in March 14th of 2018. There were 4,400 walkouts on that day, we think, from kindergartens to homeschool all the way up to university levels. And what Lara and Jeremy and I found in this last week's of data analysis is that, at least in the state of Pennsylvania, there's a very strong correlation between whether one of those enough walkouts took place in March 14th, 2018, and whether there's been a racial justice protest in the same school district in the past 5 weeks. And so, you know, it's a profound moment. It's a major galvanizing movement in this country that has accumulated its power from below for years. And, you know, we know that this matters. Dan Gillian, Legina Gauss, Omar Wassow, their research has showed that, you know, the more people who protest, and particularly Black-led protests, have major impacts on the issues that we discuss at the national, state, and local levels, electoral outcomes, public opinion, whether concessions are made to the movements, whether defections happen, that is, people who used to think and act one way move over to the other side. And I think that we're seeing this very quickly and in very rapid order, this sudden shift in opinion. Support for Black Lives Matter has shot up over the past 5 weeks in a major way. We saw Ella Jones get elected to be the mayor of Ferguson on June 2nd, the first Black woman mayor of Ferguson, Missouri. We have seen corporations, we have seen the NFL, we have seen many different established institutions start to make real and costly concessions to the movement. We've started to see Confederate monuments topple all over the country. So I think that this is actually a moment that is signaling the start of a new generation of American politics. And that's how I'll start out on an optimistic note.
Yeah, thank you for that. And having the numbers and the scale is just so helpful, I think, in putting this moment into context. But Kanisha, you know, you and I really enjoyed having our conversation earlier this week. And I know that one of the things we talked about was this idea that sometimes just looking at the numbers can mask a lot of other questions about power and scale and agency within these movements. And so I want to invite you into this conversation because I know you've done so much work getting inside and opening up the black box of some of these movements, talking with leaders and organizers who are on the front line and creating and nurturing these kind of spaces. So I wonder what you're seeing and what you're thinking as you look at this wave of protest unfolding everywhere.
Yeah, sure. So thank you for having me. And thank you to everybody that's tuning in. So I want to honor sort of like the time and the energy it takes to sit through a webinar, even if you're just listening. So, you know, I appreciate that. Everyone who took the time to do that. I think, you know, I do spend a lot of time sort of talking to, and then also maybe watching, right, sort of participants and organizers and the process of mobilization. So, you know, the context that the Crowd Counting Consortium and Erica and colleagues are able to provide, and I'm really happy to have been able to participate in that in some way, is really important to, like you say, sort of give us the broad contours of the scope. But what's actually happening to produce sort of those particular mobilizations is often a lot messier and really nonlinear in a lot of important ways. So I've been kind of doing this kind of work since roughly about 2014. And sort of the other thing that I'll say about Erica's comments, I'm so glad that you mentioned Ferguson, because I think a lot of the capacity and a lot of the energy and a lot of the underlying political analysis that people are bringing to their respective mobilizations is really rooted in sort of the energy and the resilience of the people from Ferguson, right? So, in 2014, when you see sort of everyday citizens taking to the street and being assaulted en masse by the American government, what that provides you in terms of background understanding of what the context is in which we're working, I don't think can be overstated. And that's something that I hear again and again from people that I talk to that have participated in a variety of ways, in a variety of events. So maybe I can say sort of what I'm seeing or what I'm learning from people, as well as what I'm seeing in terms of how people are still being challenged. I think because that negotiation of power relationships in these crowds and during these mobilizations is really ongoing, and it's incredibly fluid, and that is probably at the core of what's going to explain why we see whatever we do into the future. So the first thing I think probably that can't be overstated is that there are a lot of reasons why people find themselves in the streets or on Twitter or on Instagram or on the phone. There are a lot of modes by which people can participate. And I think, we do kind of maybe as academics need to be a little bit careful about sort of casting the scope of the movement or the moment, however it is that we want to think about it, in terms of bodies in the street. Because there are a lot of people who either can't or don't want to be in the street for a lot of very incredibly valid reasons. But of those that sort of I've at least been able to access who have largely been in the streets, for a lot of folks, this is an expression of grief, an ongoing expression of grief. In that grief is some empowerment, almost always, right? So where, the president of the United States or other people might want to characterize that as defiance, there is a sense of agency that folks are feeling about being able to sort of speak for themselves. And so I also really want to be careful as an academic to not speak for people. There's very little that I can say about what folks in the streets, quote unquote, want that they haven't said themselves, right? So in a way, I'm just kind of like parroting what I've already heard. And that's actually really important. Think about how many people don't have sort of a public platform, for whatever reason, to be able to make clear what it is they want, or when they do it, that they're not listened to, right? So defund the police means defund the police. What defund means to different people can vary. And that in itself is a political negotiation amongst individuals that are making that claim. But when we ask folks what they want and they tell us, and then we tell them, well, you're not really clear enough about that. Or are you sure that's what you mean? That's in itself sort of a form of at least narrative violence that is pretty consistently applied to certain portions, at least, of not just the American, but the global population in general. That needs to be, I think, accounted for. So folks are experiencing both grief or sort of expressing both grief and empowerment. There's, some negative emotions out there. There's anger, there's frustration, right? But there's also really positive emotions out there. There's compassion and there's love and there's joy. And those things often sometimes are missed too. And sort of any given action can communicate a number of these underlying motivations. And I think to flatten people out into simply one doesn't do a whole lot of justice to the complexity and the depth of the mobilization. So that's kind of what I see folks expressing, and sort of all underscored by this, what is seeming to be much more commonly accepted understanding that defending and protecting Black life is defending and protecting American life, right? So the process of centering Blackness, Black experience, Black people, the vulnerability that comes along with Blackness, both sort of politically and otherwise, is something that's real, it's something that's meaningful, and it's something that's everyone's responsibility to recognize, regardless of how you characterize yourself or how others would characterize you. So just really quickly on the flip side, sort of what I see folks still kind of struggling with is actually what that means in practice, right? So how exactly to center Blackness, what does that mean? What does it mean to lead? What does it mean to follow when there are certain political principles that ought to be guiding our behavior? And if that political principle is, in fact, inversions of corrupted power relationships, particularly as they're rooted in racial and then also sex and gender hierarchies, also class hierarchies. not just in the United States, but around the world, sort of a bit of reprogramming to figure out sort of how to step back from our privileges and to sort of not sort of work from that perspective, even in the context of a single crowd on a random corner, is a struggle for a lot of people. There is a lot of political analysis that's being developed on the fly. Mm-hmm. Some of that is exciting, right, to watch people learn in real time. Some of it is, disheartening to watch the pushback as people realize how difficult it can be actually to recognize how deeply ingrained some of these patterns are in American life. So I think maybe I'll leave it there, a sort of general overview, but I can certainly come back to any of that later if you want.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Filipe, I want to bring you into the conversation also because, of course, like all of this that Kanisha and Erica have so well described to us is happening in the context of this global pandemic. And so, this moment is so unique in so many ways. And so I know that you have done work on previous pandemics and how they impact things like elections and other politics. And so as we look ahead to the coming months, how do you think these streams of protest and the pandemic and the ways in which they come together or not are going to affect our elections and other elements of the political process?
First of all, thanks a lot, Hari, for inviting me here. It's really a pleasure to be part of this discussion and just learning a lot from it. So the research that you mentioned, it's interesting because I think it illustrates sort of a number of different ways in which I think that the context of a pandemic might interact with the movement that's going on right now in ways that I think are going to be very meaningful for the election, but also beyond, I think. So the work that we've been doing relates to the Ebola episode, which was obviously a big public health emergency in West Africa, but not quite so much, let's say, here in the US, but was sort of a big media narrative and really sort of represented a threat or was perceived by a lot of people as a threat. And what we find here is that that kind of fear aspect in terms of electoral politics manifested itself in favor of Republicans in the event in 2014, who were kind of exploiting that theme, but in specific ways, not related necessarily to some of the things that they were trying to get at, like associating President Obama to the Ebola so-called crisis, but in ways that relate to attitudes towards immigration, towards kind of otherness in that sense. And you might think that this, in this case, would play out in favor, let's say, of President Trump, and in ways that might go in that direction. But here's where I think this event is very different from previous events, because it's not just a matter of triggering emotional responses in people. And I think that actually speaks to some of what the impact of the protests themselves are. But it's about a context where there is a huge economic impact and a huge kind of policy failure that is taking place, right? And that, which relates to other things that I've researched pertaining to political protests, I think affect the motivations that people have and the willingness that people have to show up in what are, frankly, costly displays of political mobilization, right? It's, going out on the streets, and particularly in the context of a pandemic, involves personal costs that are quite high. And what we see in that type of research is that the economic environment matters a lot, not just in terms of, let's say, the dissatisfaction that people may have and that people may, be willing to take to the streets related to that, which I think is not so much what's going on here, although it might be related, but also in the what we would call, sort of as economists, the opportunity cost of being out there, right? So in a context where the economy is facing sort of depression-like conditions, right? People, very high unemployment levels, sort of the cost of mobilization is affected by that as well. So I think the context of a pandemic really is related to, I guess, or at least that's a valid hypothesis, is related to the scale and the reach of these protests. And we know, as Erica mentioned, that the protests themselves can have electoral implications as well, right? We know that from all sorts of different methods, different types of protest, across different motivations and ideological flavors, if you will. So I think it's very much related in the sense that the environment of the pandemic and the broader crisis that it's brought about affects the dynamics of the protests, and it sort of feeds back into the a kind of movement that I think may very well have electoral consequences in directions that are very different, I think, from previous sort of public health episodes as well.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So I want to, I feel like just hearing all of you talk, you know, one of the words that's kind of sitting with me is a word, Kanisha, that you use, which is the idea of negotiation, you know, and that there's so much negotiation going on right now in terms, like inside the protests, as the leaders and the organizers are creating these new and different kind of spaces, but then also there's a negotiation with all sorts of political processes and existing institutions in society. And you know, all of you in different ways have done work that looks at the relationship between, you know, protest or, you know, activism and the negotiation of a political process. And I'm curious, as you all think about this moment, like, where do you see the biggest opportunities? You know, I think that you know, as Erica said, we're in this unprecedented moment. It feels like there's a generational turn here, perhaps, and this opportunity for change that maybe we haven't had before, but it's fraught in all the ways that Kanisha and Filipe that you described to us. And so I would love to hear you all reflect on where you see some of the opportunities. Maybe Erica, I'll turn it over to you first and see if Filipe or Kanisha, if you wanted to jump in.
Thanks. So three things came to mind right away. The first is the opportunity to keep the issues on the agenda that have come onto the agenda as worthy of discussion in a way that we haven't seen in a long time. So defunding the police, basically the idea of reparations, which is now widely considered as something that people need to take seriously, discuss, and figure out how to address.
Yeah.
The issue of abolition of the carceral system in general. I mean, these are ideas that a few years ago were considered to be not something that mainstream politicians could engage and expect to be taken seriously, and all of a sudden it's like they all have to engage it or won't be taken seriously. And you know, you could argue that there is a partisan divide to that, but there's also a really significant growth in the number of people among liberals and independents that are now viewing it this way. So there's a larger coalition, it's expanding, and I would argue is a potentially permanent change in the way that these agendas are being negotiated. The second big opportunity is the ways in which this moment can affect the actual political opportunity structure itself. So one of the things that a lot of social movement scholars often recognize is that, you know, movements have to operate within a political opportunity structure. They have to, you know, there are various constraints on what's possible for them to do based on, you know, who's in office, you know, whether they have the right to vote or not, if you're talking about democracies versus non-democracies and things along those lines. And so, you know, elections, when we get to have them, are one of the few ways that social movements can mobilize to affect their political opportunity structure. And so, you know, it's probably no mistake that there are many activists around the country who are now using the organizational capacity that they've built to try to mobilize around voter rights and voter registration and electoral participation. So groups like Black Voters Matter have, you know, really been supercharging in this moment, and I think that's going to have potentially important impacts as well, among many other organizations. And then the third thing that comes to mind is the idea of mutual aid. So the pandemic, I think, recharged this concept of mutual aid associations, neighborhood associations, organizations that were meant to try to address urgent needs within one's community and to sort of redistribute resources from the bottom up, because nobody's going to do it for us among established institutions. So I actually think that the fact that we're seeing the supercharged street demos and in terms of our moment is in part because the groundwork of mutual aid and what that does to thinking around one's responsibility civically to participate and take responsibility for community well-being has, because of the pandemic, been brought to us over and over and brought home on a daily basis for months prior to this. And so there's something about the interaction of that I hope we don't lose. I think it's an important form of kind of social capital that can help to create a healthy democratic system.
Yeah, so I just want to I want to jump in here and then see Kanisha or Filipe if you wanted to add. So if I want to play devil's advocate, like I agree with a lot of what you said, Erica, but to me, the place where I feel worried sometimes as I look around is it feels like there's a real disconnect right now between our institutional politics and what we might call protest politics or politics in the street or whatever the term is that you want to use. And it almost feels like they're moving on separate tracks, so that, you could see it, you could imagine, Filipe, to your point, a situation where, it come November, one party takes control of Congress and federal government, and they feel like, oh, look, we've been able to make change. But Kanisha, as you've pointed out, like the change that we need is so much bigger than just one election or anything like that. And how do we heal that divide? What are the things that need to be happening now to ensure that you don't have that kind of disconnect persist over time?
So, yeah, I can jump in on this. Maybe kind of stringing both of your sets of comments together. So I think the thing that kind of connects quote unquote protest politics and institutional politics, which really aren't that disconnected, is people, right? So what's happening right now, I think the thing that we should be most optimistic about or looking most forward to sort of continued development in is sort of how communities are being built and rebuilt, right? So even just, right, like here in DC, like we're based in DC, right? There have been a couple of hyper-local elections that have resulted in new candidates joining the city council that had platforms that would have been thought to be like entirely radical, literally 3 months ago, right? Whatever the groundswell was that led to these elections in DC, that did not just happen 3 months ago, right? There was a community of people who were in a sense sort of hamstrung by the sort of regularly scheduled nature of institutional politics, right? We couldn't necessarily see or weren't looking for the sort of expression of their political positions until we had that specific moment. But sort of, yes, partially, I think, because of the pandemic and some of the sort of experiences that people have had being more quote unquote quiet lately, folks having a little bit more time to think about what's going on around them and how they're interacting with what's going on around them has led to some more communitarianism, but a lot of that was already there, right? So it's not that mutual aid networks and associations largely just came out of nowhere. There were more people who realized the value of them, right? And so where there was already infrastructure, then we could begin to take advantage of it differently. The same politics that I've been talking about seeing in the street or that you see online or that you would see sort of in a community meeting are also happening in those networks too. So that is kind of Hari speaking to that scope of the broader issue, which is like a fundamental reordering of politics and an understanding of what racial hierarchy, not just in the United States, but around the world does to ordering that politics. But I think the thing that's most exciting, right, is that you just watch so many people having such a profound political education right now. And the fact that it's so wide ranging is really heartening. How many people have just learned what the bail system looks like in their city or their town, right? That's a really important institutional bit of politics that impacts people's everyday lives, and that is reflected in some of these disproportionate outcomes that we see amongst people who are disproportionately disadvantaged over time and across place, right? How many people just learned sort of what the common policing tactics are in their town. I hear all the time from folks who didn't realize how many police agencies there were that had jurisdiction in Washington, D.C., or didn't know sort of why the president was able to mobilize certain policing agencies in DC and did not have that capacity elsewhere. This is kind of a basic understanding of how politics works that's beyond just voting, that's beyond just sort of picketing. Not that there's anything wrong with those, but there's a broader scope, I think, of politics in which people can engage themselves in, that they're recognizing now, and they're recognizing what it takes to make that resonant with their own politics.
Yeah. So we have a bunch of really great questions coming in from the audience, and so I want to turn to those in just a second. But Filipe, I just want to make sure that you have a chance to jump in here, because I know that we put a lot of ideas on the table. So before I turn to questions.
Thanks, Ari. I'll be very quick, because I think this interaction between these other forms of political participation and electoral politics, I very much agree that they intersect in ways. So you could frame it, Hari, to your earlier sort of devil's advocate point and say, like, look, the lack of responsiveness of these big institutional politics to people's concerns, right? All the gridlock and so on and so forth. In itself, they might have led people to consider other forms of mobilization, right? And say, like, look, this is not working, just voting. Our voices are not being heard. Let's do something different, right? But I think this then flips back, as I think Kanisha was alluding to, back into electoral politics, because, you know, there's no, if we think about like exit and voice, there's no exit from electoral politics, really, because you may exit, but it keeps affecting you, right? This big institutional politics. So there's this big incentive to flip back these new forms of mobilization and again, as Erica pointed out, kind of try to influence elections using this. And I think more broadly, there's a technological change we may keep discussing, which has made other forms of mobilization more effective, right? The fact that you can now mobilize in rural areas of the country and have an impact, because this can be seen on social media, you can film it, you can put it out there. Whereas in previous eras, this would be like essentially completely invisible. I think that radically changes the possibilities as well, which again, will come back into the large institutional politics from the bottom up, as Kanisha was alluding, but I think it connects ultimately.
That's great. So we have so many questions that have come in about the, about both the kind of like the precursors to this moment and also what we can see going forward. One question to start with might be, JB asks, what are your thoughts on traditional versus non-traditional modes of political, racial, and social advocacy in the age of COVID-19? And which of these modes seem to be most resonant with the younger generation? So I don't know if any of you have seen any data on that or had any thoughts on traditional versus non-traditional ways of getting involved, the ways in which the pandemic had shaped that, and particularly whether or not there are any generational dimensions to it.
I just want to jump in really quick, maybe with a question back for JB,
yeah.
Which is, what do you mean by traditional versus non-traditional, right? So virtually everything that we see happening in service of the defense and protection of Black life and the reordering of American politics has happened since the beginning of sort of the country's inception. And I would say in almost all of the countries where we see this sort of mobilization happening, sort of there has been this range of behaviors. So, you know, we could think about traditional versus not traditional as inside versus outside. So maybe that institutional versus protest politics heuristic that Hari gave. Some people, I know, and I don't want to put this on JB, but I've heard it be sort of violent versus non-violent, as traditional versus non-traditional. Personally, I would push back, I think, on that sort of dichotomizing. I think making it binary in that way does too much violence to actually the dynamism of, like we were saying before, what the relationship is amongst all of these modes, and gets us in a position where we start to moralize more than we start to strategize.
Erica, let me take a question that was for you, which is that you had mentioned the correlation between Black Lives Matter and youth gun control demonstrations earlier in our conversation. The questioner is asking whether or not you've seen any correlations between to other public protests, Women's March, synagogue bombings last year, other things that you all may have been tracking in your data.
Yeah, it's a good question. We haven't had a chance to look yet. So I can't say. The only data that we had been able to take a look at so far is that March 14th, 2018 event. But I wouldn't be surprised if there are correlations to other forms of mobilization previously. It's just that the correlation is slightly weaker than you might expect, because there's so many more events right now where there were no events before. So so there's definitely a diffusion effect that's taking place, but a strong correlation with at least that one youth-led, which is largely also led by Black youth and people of color in many school districts.
Yeah, and so we had another question that came early on in our conversation where, Suzanne asked, is this uprising really sudden? Is it not the galvanizing of an organized growth over years of engagement, visibility, and mobilization? And, Kanisha, both you and Erica, I think have spoken different ways about the ways in which there is probably, there's kind of like this invisible organizing that went on that all of a sudden has become more visible in this moment. And would one of you, be comfortable with kind of like unpacking that for our audience a little bit? Like, what is that work that's been going on that then enabled this outpouring to happen now?
So much, I think, and again, sort of this, I do not want to suggest that this is in any sort of way a linear process, but I think at least sort of in the earliest days immediately following the killings of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd, that there was a lot of spontaneity that actually had very little to do with infrastructure, right? So movement infrastructure can provide some opportunities, but sort of movement mobilization, sort of from the most bottom-up level, the way that Filipe put it, I think was right, can be driven by slightly different things, even if they're working together. So maybe that's just the main thing that I wanted to say, right? Is that sort of, movements aren't just sort of the institutions that are able to funnel money to different projects and to sort of justify people's participation in politics in a particular way, right? There's a lot that happens amongst individuals who aren't affiliated with any organization, or there's a lot of resource sharing amongst individuals that don't have sort of formal channels to put this together. And some of that gets lost, I think, in the rush sometimes to sort of put a name and to put a face on the movement, to call it, these are the Black Lives Matter protests, this is what they want, this is who's in and who's out. And that is not doing justice, I think, to what really the roots of the current mobilization is.
Mm-hmm. If I may jump in just for a quick second, but Kanisha has talked about the nonlinearity aspect of it, and I think that's a fundamental part of it, right? So there's this long literature in social science kind of trying to explore the fact that these movements always seem sudden, right? Or very often seem like sudden. It's like, oh, they came out of the blue. And because they have these nonlinear feature where like you see people out there because of some initial mobilization, then you realize that a lot more people share your views than you thought before, and there's strength in numbers. So there's like a lot of that feels like, oh, there's this massive eruption, quote unquote, out of nowhere, which belies all of the fertile ground in which and ground that has been fertilized by a lot of work that is taking place, quote unquote, invisibly. And then that groundswell takes place in this nonlinear fashion. I think that's very much an illustration of that broader pattern as well.
Yeah, great. Erica, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, just very quickly. I definitely second the point Kanisha had brought up earlier about the Ferguson connection. And I do think that part of the reason we are where we are today is because the set of conversations, the set of imperatives that emerged out of the Ferguson uprising helped to create narrative control in this moment in a way that's really important, because there were attempts in the first week of the anti-racism uprisings to completely delegitimize the movement and participants in the movement as violent rioters, et cetera, and the amount of narrative control that responded to that threat was profound. And I think that the movement, such as it is, was able to basically move past quickly these claims of, rioting, violence, criminal, these are very typical responses of governments that feel threatened. It did not affect the movement in the sense that it became even more powerful in response to those attempts to undermine it, because people were easily able to reject that and keep the conversation focused on the lawlessness of police violence against Black lives and the fact that we want this to be no longer happening. It's been happening too long. Too many people are too late to this conversation. We're done with that, and we're moving forward as a country. And there is something really profound about the fact that the political education that happened in the country between Ferguson and today took root in so many people around the country. So even that might be invisible. It might be less related to movement infrastructure, but it's a massive resource that I think made a huge impact in this movement maintaining momentum.
Yeah, it sounds, part of what I draw from that is this idea that, the strategic agility that, emerges from having built this work in the past, done this work in the past is just so important in responding to the dynamism of any moment like now. So I'm just looking, I know we're coming close to the end of our time, but we have a set of questions that are about the election that maybe, Filipe, I'll just I'll put a few of them on the table and you can respond to the ones that you want to. So, one person asked, do we feel like the protests offer hope for more active engagement in voting for people that may have checked out in the past? Should we be concerned about state-sponsored efforts at voter suppression? As a counterpoint to the growing mobilization around social justice. And then the third question I'll put out there is this idea that while there are some tremendous opportunities to decrease inequalities, are the election processes ready or able to respond and adapt to all the contingencies that are necessary? So I know there's a lot packed into each one of those questions. And so Filipe, I'll give you some time to respond, and then maybe we can wrap things up.
So very quickly about the voter suppression and whether we should be concerned, I think the answer is just yes.
Right.
But it actually brings us back to the issue of the mobilization that I think we've touched upon multiple times here, which is this idea that these are not two separate spheres, right? That, the electoral and the different forms of mobilization, and they obviously connect in ways that are about the infrastructure and about the all the sort of social capital that builds around these forms of mobilization, but also in terms of how people feel with respect to responsiveness of that other, which I agree with Kanisha. These are, and the point is that these are not kind of separate; they're intertwined, but kind of they are different in some sense. But if people feel that there's a lack of responsiveness there, that also affects their incentive to mobilize in ways that can be very complicated, right? You can imagine that people get discouraged and then go into other forms of mobilization. But if there's no feedback from there, then there's further discouragement. So that remains to be seen. But I think what is definitely clear is that there is this interaction, and it's being shaped, literally as we speak.
So we are at the end of our time. Unfortunately, we still have a lot of questions that we didn't get to. But Erica and Kanisha, maybe I'll just give you a chance to sort of offer any closing thoughts that you might have as my computer crashes around me. And maybe in particular, I would love to know kind of where you all are drawing your hope as we move forward. So, Erica, maybe I'll start with you, and then Kanisha give you the last word, and then we'll wrap up.
I'll just say that crowd counting has real benefits if you're looking for hope. Reading stories in newspapers every day from around the country, you'll see stories about 6-year-olds organizing marches in their communities that hundreds of people show up to. And in small towns around the United States, they're seeing the first protests they've had in anybody's living memory. And the signs that they're holding are quoting Audre Lorde. So if there's one, that's different. Something is different, and that gives me hope.
So my hope is actually more a request or a demand, right? That sort of we don't actually wait for expressions of grief or trauma or videos of Black death for people to realize actually sort of the foundations of American politics and to think deeply about what those foundations mean for our everyday lives. Structural problems always have individual implications, but there's no individual solution to a systemic problem. So the more we focus on that, the more we take that in, and the more we acknowledge the deep importance of that to whatever it is we're doing, wherever it is we're doing it, I think that we've got a lot of room to grow.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And thank you, Erica, Kanisha, Filipe, for being with us here today for this really important conversation. And thanks to our audience for watching and for sending in all your great questions. I'm sorry that we couldn't get to them all. And at SNF Agora, we want to thank you all for being a part of our webcast series, both today and over the past few months. We've really enjoyed being able to host this webcast and are grateful to have had the opportunity to connect with so many people since we began in March. We're going to be taking a break now for the rest of the summer, but we'll be back in the fall with a new webcast series, and we'll be focusing on the upcoming US elections in that series. So if you'd like to hear more about our events as they're announced, we invite you to visit our website and sign up for our e-newsletter at snfagora.jhu.edu. You'll also find a recording of today's webcast on that website. So thanks again. I really hope to see you all again in the fall.